We talked about this briefly, but this idea that for some, negotiating with strangers feels very different than negotiating with friends or even members of your family. There's the immediate family and, of course, the concentric circles outside. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I've come to learn is that this is not universal. Our feelings about what is more challenging is not necessarily the same as the person next to you. And one of the reasons that these kinds of negotiations can be particularly difficult is the role that scripts play. And by scripts, I mean we have these kind of stories that play out in our heads about how we interact with particular members of our family. And there are these dynamics that have patterns that have been set up for years, if not decades, that are very hard to change and to overcome. And so we have these specific stories, but we also have these scripts for how we interact with friends versus strangers versus family members. So again, these are general as well as specific, like, every time I negotiate with this person, they become irrational and I retreat. I go somewhere else. I just can't bear to be in this conversation. Or it could be, yes, when I negotiate with my brother, it's always a tit for tat. It's never, let's try to do something together, but rather, I'll give you X if you give me Y. And you know what those scripts are when you think about it. And they can help as well as hinder. I mentioned this also in class, this idea that, again, you perhaps trust the people that you know best, or do you? And these kinds of histories impact how we look at our relationships with members of our family or close friends. They tend to be uncomfortable because primarily there is a cost conflict, right? So some stranger or some customer or some colleague, you think, well, I can always change companies, I can always work with a different vendor. But within family relationships, well, you're kind of stuck with your family unless, of course, you decide not to engage with them anymore. And so, this idea of the difficulty also plays out in terms of, the research shows us, less integrative solutions than they are when we negotiate with strangers. So it's not that having an integrative and creative solution isn't possible with people we know well. It just means we have to recognize those scripts for what they are and be mindful, be proposive about trying to find a solution that is in fact creative and integrative, one that creates value instead of claims value. And again, if you think about the earliest interaction you might have had with a sibling, fighting over the last cookie, it may be hard to recognize and rise above those kinds of histories that tend to repeat themselves. Again, I mentioned this idea of the importance of maintaining the relationship. And again, I can imagine some of us, and I'm no exclusion, we've loaned money to a friend and we feel uncomfortable asking for it back, even though, of course, we're entitled. And so we say nothing, but perhaps we start to resent that person for not keeping their word, for not valuing their commitment to us. And so the kinds of studies that have been done looking at negotiation where relationships are very close and familial, etc., can create these problems because we may opt to value the relationship more than the issue, but then the issue not being resolved or not being resolved satisfactorily could create resentment in the future. And again, because so many of us are uncomfortable with conflict and we bury it, not all of us, but many of us, these conflicts may be buried for a while, but when you least expect it, they erupt. and they could really destroy a relationship when you least expect it. So to do business with family and friends, there are lots and lots of examples. Some of these examples are more informal, where perhaps you vacation at the same cabin every year, and there's just sort of a kind of an informal way of splitting the costs. But there are other situations that are more formal, where members of the family might go in 50-50, or other ways to actually purchase an item. And that can work out fine unless and until something changes. One member of the family passes away, or there's a divorce, or something passes to a child that is not really interested. And again, I don't need to tell you specific stories. I'm sure you've all heard, if not experienced, stories like this. And despite the challenges of family-owned businesses, we live in an environment where very many of these businesses are in fact family-owned. So it may not affect you directly. Many of you may be working for larger corporations, and I know some of you are, but that doesn't mean that these issues don't exist. In fact, some people will leave their large corporations and start their own consultancies or family businesses. I mentioned in class that while it is the most common form of business around the world, very few make it to the second or the third generation because of all of the issues that exist. I don't need to reiterate these or read them to you. They're here, but again, there's been quite a bit of research in this area, and one of the best ways to reduce the likelihood of these kinds of issues happening involve the use of communication, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So again, these specific challenges of assumptions that we make, right? Because we are all members of the same family, we must have the same goals. And so we make this assumption without saying anything. So we have the appearance of harmony when in fact there may not be harmony, and we find ways to cope or to keep ourselves out of the fray. Or there are some more specific issues of people who will not risk damaging the relationship in their mind by asking for what they want, for fear of appearing too greedy, or as I mentioned, this idea that because we share the same last name, we must assume that we share the same values and the same assumptions about growing the family business. So rather than discuss those things explicitly, in many families, those issues never get put on the table to have this conversation. And again, there are all these other issues that, as I mentioned, you have the intersection of one or more of these three bubbles in a Venn diagram, that there is a blood tie, family tie, that there is a role of actual working in the business, having a management role, which may or may not be connected with being a family member, and then playing a governance role. So somebody could be a member of the board, for example, because of their last name, and once a quarter, twice a year, be involved in conversations, but not be involved in the day-to-day operations of the business. So if you think of those three circles and where they intersect, only a very few are right there in the center of all three. So thinking about that special challenge kind of, really heightens why we have these conversations. Again, this idea that, work and family may spill over in general, but how much more challenging it is when you share a relationship with a person that you also share professional responsibilities with. And for those of you who've been there or seen that, you know what kind of challenges we're talking about. And so recognizing these challenges, recognizing what assumptions we make about what is fair, what is equitable, what is equal, right? I mentioned the idea of two children, so they should share equally, but should they? Look at Christopher and Benedicta. These are the two children of Axel, the founder. She has chosen, or perhaps they have chosen, for her not to be part of the day-to-day running of the business so far. But is there an opportunity in the future? And if so, would she be interested? And if so, in what capacity, and what is her role vis-a-vis Christopher's role? And if she were to come in now, how does that compare to the previous years and the current time that Christopher has been serving in the business? How does that square up with the fact that her husband Ulrich has been very much involved in a leadership role in the business? So there's a lot going on in family businesses, and in this steel company, there is no exception. So how conflicts that will likely arise in a family business can be prevented or managed include, as I mentioned before, a lot of communication early and often. Again, assuming that we're all on the same page because we're all descendants of the founder is a very dangerous assumption. Letting issues fester, valuing the relationship over the issue might seem like a good idea at the moment, but when they fester, of course, that creates resentment and a more difficult time finding agreement. We talked about, of course, being clear about what we want and asking for that, and listening, right? Again, we have those scripts about how we interact with our family, but when we pay attention to others, when we care to hear what they have to say and actually open our minds and our hearts to hear, there is a much greater chance that they'll listen to you, which is hard when you're defensive, when you're feeling attacked, as members of this family will be. Of course, there's the challenge of, in any communication, hearing more than what's being said in the 7% total of the words that are being spoken, right? The communication. So effectively communicate is one big category. Another one is managing expectations. And this, let's take Benedicta for a moment. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that she were to become more involved in the family business in some way. We don't really know what her skill set is, or at least the bounds of her skill sets. What does it mean that she is the primary caregiver of their daughter? What happens if there's a lot going on at school and she's involved? What happens if she decides to go back and get a business degree? What happens with Maria and the next big acting gig she lands? So as in any situation, it's important to let people know what's coming and help them plan accordingly. It's even more so critical in a family business, again, because of what little may be said and how much may be assumed. Anticipating that there'll be conflicts is also a good way to prevent conflicts. What are those things that are likely to come up? As opposed to, let's just not say anything and hope it doesn't come up, right? So what are the conflicts that are likely to arise? How can we not only communicate well, listen well, and manage expectations, but how might we kind of allow others to have the space that they might need, and the support that they may need if you have a sense of what may be coming. So anticipating and asking others what their issues and interests may be to try to stave off the kinds of conflicts that can very much undo a family business. And this particular piece speaks well to the challenge before you that Annalise has made, and that is, what is a process moving forward for reducing the likelihood that these conflicts arise and damage the family business? And so there's a relatively, 15 plus years study that talks about 5 specific characteristics of processes, multiple processes, that help in family business. And I don't want to get into too much detail there, but as you read through them, you can see that fairness is about communication and ensuring that people are heard, not just about the outcome, but about the process. And you may have studied in your leadership class that when we talk about justice in an organization, some element that we talk about is the difference between procedural and distributive justice. Distributive justice is looking at the allocation of rewards or bonuses or outcomes and saying, okay, well, it's fair or it's not. But a lot of research shows that distributive justice is more important, and that is, I can live with an outcome not being equitable as long as the process for determining those outcomes is transparent. So if I know what's gone into the process of deciding and it's consistent in how it's being carried out, and there is a commitment to fairness, that I have input, etc., then I'm okay with an outcome that's not equal or equitable as long as I understand the meaning behind it. So it's about the transparency of the process, and that also is the case in family business. Finally, there is some research that talks about, again, the importance of trust, the importance of common ground. And rather than tackle it on a what are we going to do in this steel business, it's important to start small. Where does the trust exist? How can we interact in such a ways that we're consistent, that we demonstrate that we do what we say we're going to do, that we follow through on our promises and commitments, that we demonstrate an interest to upholding the principles of the company more so or above our own individual interests. And sometimes it's important, when conflicts do exist, to have a trust catalyst. And this may or may not be a member of the family who does inspire trust between members who others respect and seek the counsel of. And so when those conflicts arise, not if, when those conflicts arise, it can be that this particular person is called in to mediate, to help be an impartial sounding board for the issue that's being discussed. So this is going to be an exciting negotiation, and I look forward to hearing and seeing what you do with it. So the next 2 slides are just kind of reminders of where we are in the negotiation, and good luck. As a reminder, these are the folks who are involved in this situation. And you can pause the slides to read it carefully. You will be assigned one of these roles. In most cases, there will not be someone playing the role of Annalise, but in one or more cases that will happen. So you see who is involved, and finally, the actual negotiation that I want you to engage in and prepare for is taking place 9 months after these scenes. So hesitatingly, Christopher has agreed, in fact, to take over the family business, which results in Ulrich, the person who fully expected to take over in that role, despite him only being related via his wife, who is Christopher's sister, and the daughter of Axel. So there's some awkwardness there. Christopher, in taking of the business, does respond to the pressures that the creditors have placed upon him, announcing layoffs of about 200 employees, and has been meeting regularly with the management team of Leon Steel, with the conversation moving toward hammering out the details of a possible merger. Maria, 9 months later, has become increasingly unhappy. Her husband is more and more stressed out, less and less available, and even when he is available, he is shutting her out, and she's not happy about that. They're just literally growing apart, and that's not doing their relationship any good. She's also unhappy being forced to kind of be in Denmark, where Christopher's running the business, so she regularly goes back to Sweden, where she has friendships and as well acting gigs. So she's coming back and forth. And, you know, if you're playing Maria, not surprisingly, she would like to patch things up, like to return her relationship to the state it was before Axel took his own life. And another character that you see that has some interests here is Niels. He has, you know, substantial experience with the business, substantial knowledge with all things financial. He would like to exert more influence, but because he is not a member of the family, other members of the family don't take his advice or don't ask for his advice. He's excluded from meetings here and there. And whether you think that's the right thing or the wrong thing, I can just tell you that that's what's been happening. Niels does know Christopher about some of his concerns about the business, as well as about some of the dynamics, including there being a rumor that has been spreading throughout the organization that is not doing Christopher nor the company any good. And Niels has some reason to believe that it's Ulrich who has spread this rumor. And whether this is true or not, we really don't know, but you can imagine that Ulrich is not very happy being cast aside despite every expectation. He even says so in the beginning of the second clip, that he is the one who should be talking to the employees and he is the one who should be taking over. So it's 9 months later and you're wondering, well, where are we? Well, where are we is in a room, a boardroom of some sort, one that most of you kind of figured out was probably organized by Annalise, the mom, who isn't there, but clearly this is of her doing. She has noticed that there is this growing conflict that started basically at the funeral, and now she's very worried about the future of the family business. And whatever means that she figured out to invite each one of you separately, here you are in this room. And you'll have about 45 minutes to have a conversation about the company. Where is it? Where is it going? Is it going to survive, or is it going to be part of Leon Steel? Is it possible to make it on its own once there have been some changes made to make it more competitive? What do you think? Where are we? Where will we be in the next 3 to 5 years? Once that's figured out, what roles will be played by whom in the organization? What do people want? What are people willing to do? What does their status as a member of the family, married into the family, or a non-member of the family? How does that figure in? And is this something that you all want to discuss? These roles, these responsibilities, are they full-time? Are they part-time? Are they ownership? Are they management? And again, you know, you can make whatever assumptions you need to make, and you might use the learnings from the article about mapping the players, but think this through. And then finally, if there is time in this conversation, can you put in place some processes, some mechanisms that reduce the likelihood that these kinds of conflicts will emerge in the future. So again, somehow Annalise, in her manipulative way, figured out how to get you all in a room together. But now that you're there, you are going to have this conversation because this has been a business in the family for quite some time. So planning for this negotiation, as I mentioned, think about what you want and the role that you've selected, given what you know about the character as you met through these two film clips, as well as your own understanding of the kinds of challenges present in negotiating with loved ones, associates, and in this particular case, members of a family business. Again, that does not only contain as its key players in the business direct blood descendants of Axel. Again, that has some impact there. So, are there any coalitions within the five of you? Obviously there are. Do you want to have a quick conversation before the five of you get together to discuss? I mean, there's obviously a little bit of a funkiness to this situation in that you didn't know that the five of you would be in the same room together, but clearly you talk to one another, those of you who share a spouse or partner and those who are members of the same family. So make any assumptions that you need to make and pick up where the film clips leave off. Thinking about, again, it's 9 months later, making any assumptions you need to make, and what will this conversation look like, and what would you be telling Annalise at the end? She wants to know.